The world at 3,000 meters was a kingdom of white and blue. A sterile, freezing purgatory where the only reality was the roar of the 1,000 horsepower Sake engine. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the 13-9-year-old leader of the 1st Air Fleet's Strike Force, sat in the observer's seat of his Nakajima B-5N Takate bomber. Tail code AI-301. The vibration of the airframe was a constant, numbing frequency that traveled up his spine and settled in the base of his skull. It was December 7, 1941. The time was 7:40 a.m. Fuchida's normal was the discipline of the Bushido, code layered over the technical precision of modern naval aviation. He wore a Hachimaki headband under his flight helmet, the red sun centered on his forehead, binding his spirit to the mission. But beneath the spiritual armor, his body was cold. The cockpit smelled of high-octane aviation fuel, leather, and the sour scent of adrenaline that had been fermenting for the 2 hours since they launched from the carrier Akagi. Below them, the cloud layer was a thick, impenetrable blanket of cotton. They had been flying dead reckoning for hours, guided only by the Honolulu radio station KGMB, which was broadcasting soft jazz music to guide in a flight of American B-17s. The irony was not lost on Fuchida. The enemy was guiding the blade too, their own throat with the sweet sounds of saxophones. Commander, the pilot, Lieutenant Matsuzaki, shouted over the intercom. Cloud break ahead. The North Shore. Fuchida leaned forward, pressing his goggles against the cold plexiglass. The whiteness tore apart like a curtain being ripped down. There it was, the Emerald Isle, Oahu. The visual shock was profound. After the endless monochrome gray of the ocean and the white of the clouds, the island was violently green. The morning sun, low and golden, lit up the jagged ridges of the Koolau Range. The surf at Kahuku Point was a white lace collar on the blue water. It was peaceful. It was silent. It was a Sunday morning paradise, sleeping off the excesses of Saturday night. Fuchida felt a tightening in his chest. This was the fragile normal of the world he was about to end. Down there, milkmen were delivering glass bottles. Priests were unlocking church doors. Sailors on the great battleships were raising the colors, thinking about baseball and breakfast. The chaos of war was miles away, in China, in Europe. Here, the biggest concern was the surf report. He shifted his gaze south, toward the Pearl River, the harbor. Even from this distance, the U.S. Pacific Fleet looked like toys in a bathtub. The Battleship Row was visible long, gray shapes moored in pairs along Ford Island. They were motionless. No smoke from the funnels. No anti-aircraft guns tracking the sky. They were naked. The machinery of survival, the elaborate network of spies, the diplomatic deceptions, the radio silence had worked perfectly. They had achieved the impossible, total tactical surprise. But the instability of human judgment was about to intervene. The plan relied on a specific signal sequence. Fuchida held a signal pistol in his hand, loaded with a black dragon flare. The protocol was strict. One flare meant surprise achieved. This would signal the torpedo bombers, the slow, vulnerable planes, to attack first, skimming the water while the Americans were still asleep. The dive bombers would wait high above too. Avoid obscuring the targets with smoke. 2 flares meant surprise lost. This would signal the dive bombers to attack first, creating chaos and suppressing the anti-aircraft guns so the torpedo planes could get in. Fuchida looked at the sleeping island. No flak, no fighters. Surprise was absolute. He opened the canopy. The wind blast was freezing and deafening, a 118-knot hurricane. He raised the pistol and fired a single. Brilliant ball of fire arced into the blue sky, trailing a thin line of smoke. 1 flare. Surprise achieved. Fuchida watched the formation. He waited for the slow, lumbering torpedo bombers commanded by Lieutenant Murata to drop down and begin their run, but they didn't move fast enough, and worse. The fighter cover the Zeros high above didn't seem to react. They continued to circle, perhaps missing the small visual cue against the bright morning sun. Fuchida felt a flash of irritation. The machinery of survival was stalling on a visual misunderstanding. If the fighters didn't clear the air, and if the dive bombers didn't hold back, the coordination would collapse. He made a split-second decision-a-judgment call, rooted in the anxiety of the moment. He reloaded the pistol. He fired a second flare. He intended it as a repetition. Hey, wake up, I said, one flare. Signal to the fighters. But to Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, leading the dive bombers high above, the second flare changed the math. 1 + 1 = 2. 2 flares. Surprise, lost. Takahashi saw the second flare and immediately assumed the Americans had spotted them. He signaled his dive bombers to attack immediately. The disturbance rippled through the air armada. The order of battle disintegrated. Instead of a surgical layered attack, torpedoes first, then bombs, everyone attacked at once. The dive bombers rolled over and screamed down from 12,000 feet, their engines howling. The torpedo bombers, seeing the dive bombers go, panicked and dove for the deck, racing to get their fish in the water before the smoke obscured the ships. Fuchida stared in horror. It was a coordinated mess. The convoy of orderly destruction he had planned was now a stampede. The dive bombers would be dropping explosions right in front of the torpedo planes. The smoke from the bombs would blind the torpedo immerse. Fuchida hissed, slamming his hand against the cockpit rail. They are ruining it. But it was too late to rescind the signal. The kinetic energy of 183 aircraft had been unleashed. The disturbance of the second flare had shattered the plan, but it had created a new, terrifying reality, a chaotic, overwhelming swarm that would confuse the American defenders even more than the original plan. Fuchida turned to his radio operator, Petty Officer Mizuki. "Send it," he ordered, his voice flat. "Send the code." Mizuki tapped the key. To Ra. 2. Ra. 2. Tiger. 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 The signal flashed across the Pacific at the speed of light. It reached the carrier Akagi. It reached the high command in Tokyo. It meant total surprise achieved, even as the signal went out, confirming the perfection of the surprise. The reality below was a chaotic scramble caused by a misunderstanding. Fuchida watched as the first bomb struck. It wasn't on a ship. It was on the seaplane ramp at Ford Island. A cloud of dirt and concrete erupted. Then, the first torpedo hit. He saw the splash as the Kate dropped its weapon. The wooden fins stabilized the torpedo in the shallow water. It ran true. A white trail of bubbles drew a straight line toward the USS Oklahoma. Thud. Even at 3,000 meters, Fuchida didn't hear the explosion over his engine. He saw it. A geyser of water, oil, and steel erupted from the side of the great battleship. The ship shuddered, a visible ripple running down its spine. Then another. And another. The hush that follows an air raid never happened. The transition was instant. 1 second, it was a sleepy Sunday. The next, it was the apocalypse. The radio waves, previously silent, exploded with American voices. Fuchida's radio operator tuned in to the local frequency. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. This is no drill. The panic in the voice was real. It wasn't the disciplined chatter of a ready defense. It was the scream of a man watching his world burn. Fuchida watched the USS Arizona. A high-altitude bomber from his own group had just dropped an armor-piercing 800-kilogram bomb. It struck near the No. 2 turret. The result defied physics. It wasn't an explosion. It was an eruption. The forward magazine detonated. the entire curve. Front half of the battleship, 30,000 tons of steel lifted out of the water. A fireball, red and angry, rose 1,000 feet into the air, turning the white clouds black. The shockwave visibly flattened the water in the harbor. He watched the horizon burning red and thought it was dawn. Fuchida thought until he realized the sun was still hours away. But the sun was up. The red was the death of the American Pacific Fleet. The oil fires began to spread, slick and black, turning the harbor into a burning lake. Tiny figure sailors were jumping from the burning ships into the burning water. Fuchida felt a strange detachment. He was the architect of this. He was the god looking down. But the disturbance, the second, flared out at him. The confusion below was absolute. Friendly fire from American guns was hitting American buildings. Dive bombers were cutting off torpedo planes. It was a brawl. He realized then that the Tora signal was a lie. It wasn't a clean, tiger-like strike. It was a messy, brutal bludgeoning. The instability of human judgment, his own impatient finger on the trigger of the flare gun had turned a surgical operation into a massacre. He circled the harbor, his plane untouched. The anti-aircraft fire was starting now, puffs of black smoke appearing in the sky, but it was ragged, inaccurate. They were shooting at the noise, not the target. Fuchida looked at the burning Arizona, the capsizing Oklahoma, the listing West. Virginia, he had one. The Empire had one. But as he watched the black smoke drift toward Honolulu, covering the Green Mountains in a shroud of soot, he felt a chill. He had woken the giant. He had poked the sleeping beast in its lair, not with a needle, but with a sledgehammer. The normal of the world had ended at 7:48 a.m. The chaos was now the only truth. Fuchida signaled his pilot to bank left, preparing to head back to the carriers. He had delivered the message.